introduction. Chairperson of the session, Honorable Professor Sadanand Mores ji, well-known poet critic, and Malin ji, I just listened to his enlightened presentation. Friends, let me have the chance to present my paper rather than reading it word by word. The two basic forces that are going to define the tone and scope of my paper are the concept of patriotism and nature of aesthetics. If I put it like this, that I am going to touch upon the concept of patriotism as it operates within the limits and the parameters set by the aesthetics. Aesthetics, in my opinion, is the soul of literature, and literature is imaginative, emotional, artistic rendering of real life. The moment these four fundamental forces, that is the imagination, emotion, art, when they capture and render the reality of the life, it gives rise to the aesthetics. Before proceeding to examine how the soul of the aesthetics is manifested in literature, patriotic literature in general, and that of Sindhi literature in particular, let me transcend the conventional parameters of aesthetics. They are confined to understand beauty as it appeals to one or more senses. But in my humble submission, when you critically look at the body of the aesthetics, it is certainly nobler and more benign force. The force which has inherent potential of moving your heart and provoking your head to ponder with the sense and the sensibility on some issue which directly or indirectly is concerned with the life. It is in this broadest sense that aesthetics is going to define my assumptions and my content. Now, in the pre-independence period, Sindhi literature, like the literatures of many other regional languages, was significantly moved by Gandhian aesthetics. I underline the word Gandhian aesthetics because it is not the job of the literature to render any philosophy or any ideology. If at all, the literature that sustains on the philosophy, the burden lies upon the poet and the readers, poets and the writers, that he or she should so commit himself or herself to the creation of the literature so that it breathes in the parameters of the aesthetics. And just Malin sir was trying to point out a very wonderful thing, the difference between patriotic literature and the universal literature. As the patriotic literature is the essential product of the interplay of the social, cultural, political situations that are prevalent at the time, therefore it demands the greater commitment so far as the parameter of the aesthetics is concerned from the writer and the poet. And coming back to the aesthetics of Gandhian, right? So all the literatures, cutting across all the linguistic boundaries, was breathing with the Gandhian aesthetics. Raja Rao from South created a wonderful masterpiece, Kantapura, in 1938, that depicts the Gandhian aesthetics at work. The characters like Murthy and Ratna, the way they carry on the Gandhian flag against all the odds, gives us insight into the actual working of the Gandhian aesthetics in hundreds and the thousands of the villages. Not only, it was not simply the Gandhian aesthetics. On the other hand, Mulkaraj Anand comes and he depicts the agony and anguish and the suffering of the character like Baka. And even Gandhi appears towards the end of this novel and he creates a sense of hope in the heart of Baka that once the freedom is achieved, what is going to happen to these untouchables like Baka, whether they are going to be the liberated from the drudgery that has become their lot for centuries together. Now, I believe that examination of such pieces from English and many other regional languages certainly lies beyond the scope of my paper, and therefore in the remaining time I would concentrate to find the rendering of the patriotism within the parameters of the aesthetics confined to the Sindhi literature. Now, here, before I touch upon some of the select passages and the poems from the Sindhi literature, let me share with one very important insight. Because without understanding that insight, we will not be able to touch the soul of the Sindhi literature. We, that is the Sindhis, were fighting for the freedom like any other communities in India, without realizing that as soon as the sun of the independence rises on this land, their ancestral land, that is the land Sindh, which had been their ancestral lands for the centuries together, would be lost forever. I do not think that there is any other community in this world that has suffered such an irreparable loss as soon as they have got the independence. Now, Mahesh Nanwani, a very important poet from the Sindhi language, puts forth this anguish in his poem, Why We Fought. This is an altogether different type of the aesthetics that defines patriotism. Because just Malin sir said, patriotism is commitment to place, commitment to a particular way, a particular culture, right? Now, another example of Govind Mali, who is considered to be the king of the Sindhi novel. He has written many novels, right? But one of the novels, which is entitled as Birds Separated from Their Flock. In this novel, he traces a development in a village in Sindh where the Hindus and Muslims had been living together in the spirit of harmony and the brotherhood, and all of a sudden from mid-30s onward, a kind of clash, a kind of confrontation began to develop between these two communities, and this clash and this conflict finally is carried to the extreme where the communal riots broke out on the eve of independence. So it was not the tale of a single particular village, but hundreds of the villages on both the sides of the borders had to see the rivers of the blood flowing from the hearts of the people. Now, when the country was, basking in the glory of independence, especially immediately in the first decade of after independence, because now there was a sense of pride in the regional literatures. There was a sense of glory that finally that goal for which we had been struggling has come true, that we have got independence. But here, the collective psyche of the Sindhi literature is different, because in spite of the best efforts by the creative minds to participate in this glory of the independence, they could not give up the agony and the anguish that was intricately associated with the word freedom. The moment you remind me of independence, one of the poets says, my wound becomes green. Again, Mahesh Nanwani says that you call me refugees, old refugees, young refugees, children refugees, and you rub salt on my wound, and even if I intend to forget, you don't allow me to forget that I am a refugee in this land. Now, it is beyond even the capacity and the potential of the best creative minds of the Sindhi language to understand and fathom the sensibility, how a particular community which had lived in India since the times of the Mohenjo-daro, and in their own, can you imagine the agony that is permanently egged in the soul of this literature? And despite the best efforts, the patriotism, the feeling of the patriotism as it is expressed creatively and aesthetically in Sindhi literature is certainly different from all the other regional languages of India, because the psyche of collective psyche of the Sindhi literature is fractured. On the one hand, the Sindhi writer does his best to show his commitment to the land of India, but at the same time, his commitment continues to the long culture of Sindh, which is the culture of secularism, which is the culture of Sufism, and therefore, despite the best efforts, that dilemma which is never resolved. It is here in this dilemma that Hamlet emphatically appears to be or not to be. When I commit myself to this land, this is a geographical land, this is my India, but what are your left behind? That was also my land, that was also the land of Mohenjo-daro. So how can I sing the songs of glory without any tinge of pain and agony? That is a trouble. And when Narayan Shah presents the high watermark of the Sindhi creativity, Sindhi poetry especially, and he says very wonderful couplet. He says, nectar is Ganga, nectar is Yamuna, but milk of mother is Sindhu. Here we have to ponder. If there is a choice between nectar and milk of mother, where shall we go? Because the question of nectar arises provided you are alive. In order to remain alive, you have to be fed on the milk of mother. So nectar is Ganga, nectar is Yamuna, but milk of mother is Sindhu. So this is a very unique aesthetics. The way the Sindhi creative mind conceptualizes patriotism by evoking the highest sense of aesthetics is something that sets the Sindhi literature apart from the other regional languages. Once again, I am reminded of another couplet of Arjan Hasit, who is considered to be the king of Sindhi Ghazal. He says, Hasit, look at my half-open eyes. Hasit, look at my half-open eyes. It is the old map of Sindh. Hasit, look at the half-open eyes. It is the old map of Sindh. Now, here you have to strain upon your intellectual powers. The concept of map is associated with the territory, but he says, look at half-open eyes. In these half-open eyes, old map of Sindh is reflected. And the aesthetic appeal arises when we concentrate on the word half-open eyes. They are not full open eyes, half-open eyes. What he sees with the half-open eyes? The new land, this India. And what is concealed in half-open eyes? The half which is closed. Half which is open is India. Half which is closed is his ancestral land. It is the cultural consciousness right from the times of Mohenjo-daro till this time and the time still to come. It is the twin objective of the patriotic feelings. On the one hand, there is the past of the 5,000 years which defines his collective psyche. On the other hand, there is the present which is confined to the territorial boundaries of India, but he is committed to both. Now, it is very difficult to understand this kind of psychological dilemma, rather, I should say cultural dilemma. And if at all I am permitted to give an analogy, think of a mother who has got two sons. One lives with her and other son lives in the place from where he cannot come back to the mother. Can you imagine the agony of that mother? One is with him, with her, another is not with him. And here, again, I would like to remind to some of the scholars who believe that the Indian literature is the diasporic literature. It is not a diasporic literature. It is a class by itself. Why? Because when you talk of the diaspora, for example, Indian people who have settled in USA, like many people, Jhumpa Lahiri, Chitra Banerjee, and so many others, when they write that it is a diasporic literature. Why? Because they are longing for India, they feel nostalgic to India, and they try to remember India there in the new land. But diasporic people still have the right to come back at any time that they like. If they come back and live in India, they can do so. But what about the Sindhi people who had left Sindh behind? Now all the doors are closed. We cannot go back and live there. Even if we want to visit, it is very troublesome to go back and visit. So therefore, this is not a diasporic. It is a literature of rootlessness. I have coined the term. It is a literature of rootlessness. It breeds in the contemporary social, political, and cultural milieu. But when it looks at its foundation, it has been snatched away from its feet. So it is a soul that is ruthlessly wandering in this continent and forgetting the geographical and the political boundaries because the poetic wings do not obey to the dictates of the tyrants, to the political dictates, or to the social conventions. In one of my ghazals, I have remarked, carrying corpses murmurs mildly. Carrying corpses murmurs mildly. On the border, Bapu stands in dilemma. This reminds of the commitment of Bapu Gandhi to the United India. When India was celebrating independence, Gandhi was away at Navakhali and trying his best to stop the communal riots. So carrying corpses murmurs mildly. On the border, Bapu stands in dilemma. Yet in another ghazal, there are so many rivers here, but my soul lies in Sindhu. There are so many rivers here, but my soul lies in Sindhu. Tell me of Sindh, tell me of Sindhu, tell me of my own soil. Yet another couplet, I will sell everything that I have in my home. I will sell everything that I have in my home in order to purchase handful of dust of Sindh. Vinod Asudani. So this kind of aesthetics continues to reverberate in the entire body of Sindhi literature. Sindhi genius, creative mind is not sure that what is patriotism. I say at the cost of this boldness that he does not know what is patriotism. Whether it is commitment to the territory, whether it is commitment to the high values of the culture, or whether it is commitment to something psychological that continues to haunt. Because in the end, I like to say that the partition for many was a political blunder. Partition for many was a historic blunder. Perhaps the politicians on both of the sides have forgot that there is something took place like partition. But partition for Sindhis is a psychological reality. To them, it is a spiritual reality, because one has to understand that the Punjabis, Sikhs got half of Punjab where they can reroot themselves in their own culture and soils. Bengalis got half of the Bengal where they can resettle themselves and then sustain their culture. But it was only the Sindhi community that had to lose entire land of Sindh to Pakistan. So how that literature can survive in the alien land, where their language is no longer spoken in the streets, where their language is no longer taught in the schools and colleges, where their language is no longer is the language of the government administration. In spite of that, if Sindhi creative mind is committed to his values, to revive and sustain the Sindhi consciousness, and he's trying to prove that he is not faithless to either of the two influences. On the one hand, he is committed. He's committed to the greatness of present India. At the same time, he is not ready, at least at the psychological level, to accept the political blunder of partition. Let there be geographical line. Let there be confrontations on the border, but there are no confrontation so far as the body of the Sindhi literature is concerned. I would like to quote Sheikh Ayaz from Sindh, the greatest voice, modern voice of Sindhi literature, Sheikh Ayaz. And he wrote that couplet at the time of Indo-Pak confrontation in 1965. He says, how can I fire across the border? How can I fire across the border? Because on the other side of the border stands my friend Narayan Sham. Because Narayan Sham and Sheikh Ayaz were together in the college, in DJs in the college in Karachi. Whether this partition could break down these psychological bonds, these social bonds, these cultural bonds, and therefore Sindhi literature is really, yesterday Kumar Prashantji was saying wonderful thing. He says that there are certain moments, they are defining moments in the history. So partition was not only the defining moment, but it was the suffused moment, confused moment in the history, and that confusion has never been cleared whatever we do. Thank you very much.